It was a slow, uneventful Saturday morning when Joe groggily awoke to sunlight filtering through his bedroom curtains. The comfort of a lazy weekend embraced him as he stretched, rubbed his eyes, and sauntered to the kitchen. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air as Joe set his coffee maker to work, a routine that kick-started his every morning. While waiting for his coffee, Joe headed to the bathroom to freshen up, completely unaware that his mundane morning was about to take a dramatic turn. As Joe went about his usual routine, brushing his teeth, washing his face, and debating whether to shave, he noticed an odd sound coming from behind him. It was a wet, slapping noise, faint but persistent. Initially dismissing it as a peculiar sound from his old plumbing, Joe continued rinsing his face. However, the noise grew louder and harder to ignore. Curiosity piqued. Joe turned around and froze. Lying on the tiled floor next to the toilet was a slimy, pulsating creature that defied explanation. The thing was a misshapen blob, mostly white with pinkish spots, dotted with tiny, beady eyes and an unsettlingly human-like mouth. "What the?" Joe exclaimed, stumbling backward into the sink. His heart raced as he stared at the alien-like intruder, a surreal mixture of horror and fascination. Gathering his wits, Joe grabbed a towel and a bucket from the kitchen. With trembling hands, he managed to nudge the creature into the bucket and fill it with water, hoping it would calm down. The creature flopped weakly for a moment before settling at the bottom, its bulbous body adapting eerily to the container's shape. Joe couldn't comprehend how such a bizarre entity had ended up in his bathroom. Desperate for answers, Joe snapped several pictures of the creature with his phone and turned to the internet for help. He uploaded the photos to social media and various forums, captioning them with pleas for identification. Responses poured in almost immediately, ranging from genuine curiosity to outright mockery. Theories ranged from a genetically modified experiment to a hoax. Despite the flood of comments, no one could identify the creature with certainty. Joe's unease deepened. Out of options, Joe decided to consult a professional. He carefully secured the bucket with a lid, placed it on the passenger seat of his car, and began driving to the nearest veterinary clinic. After several failed attempts to find an open clinic, weekends were notoriously busy. Joe finally found a veterinarian, Dr. Simmons, who agreed to examine the creature out of sheer curiosity. When Joe arrived, he carried the bucket into the clinic, feeling the weight of judgmental stares from the other pet owners in the waiting room. "What's in the bucket?" a woman holding a poodle asked, eyeing the container suspiciously. Something weird," Joe replied, offering no further explanation. He avoided their glances, focusing instead on the receptionist, who assured him the vet would see him shortly. When Dr. Simmons finally ushered Joe into the examination room, the vet's professional demeanor faltered the moment he peered into the bucket. "This is impossible," Dr. Simmons muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Joe's anxiety spiked. "What do you mean, impossible? It's just a weird fish, right?" Dr. Simmons didn't answer immediately. Instead, he began firing off questions. "Where exactly did you find this? Has it been exposed to anything unusual? Did you touch it with your bare hands?" Joe, growing increasingly alarmed, recounted the bizarre events of his morning. The vet's expression darkened as he listened, and without offering any explanation, he stepped out of the room. Moments later, Joe heard him speaking in hushed, urgent tones on the phone. When Dr. Simmons returned, his face was tense. "I've called the authorities," he said flatly. "The authorities?" Joe's voice rose in disbelief. "What are you talking about? It's just a fish, right?" Dr. Simmons didn't respond. Instead, he locked the door from the outside as he left, leaving Joe trapped in the examination room. Panic set in. Joe banged on the door, demanding an explanation, but the vet's muffled voice replied, "Stay put. The police will explain everything." Joe's thoughts spiraled into chaos. What could possibly warrant police involvement? Was this some kind of elaborate prank? Or was the creature more dangerous than he realized? The distant wail of sirens grew louder, heightening his dread. Finally, the door opened, and a stern-faced police officer entered. Joe was relieved to see another human being, but his relief was short-lived. The officer's piercing gaze made him feel as though he were the one under scrutiny. Joe stammered through his explanation, recounting the bizarre events of the morning, the strange sound, the creature's sudden appearance, and his decision to bring it to the vet. The officer listened intently, his face betraying no emotion. When Joe finished, he expected questions or at least some acknowledgement, but the officer simply nodded and walked over to the bucket. Peering inside, the officer's expression shifted from neutrality to visible shock. He turned to Dr. Simmons. "You're sure about this?" he asked, his voice low. Dr. Simmons nodded gravely. "Positive. I've never seen one in this condition, but it matches the descriptions." "What descriptions?" Joe interjected, his frustration boiling over. "What is this thing? Someone needs to tell me what's going on. Ignoring him, the officer picked up his radio and spoke a few terse words. Moments later, additional officers arrived, one of them carrying a containment box. They carefully transferred the creature from the bucket to the box, sealing it with a click. Joe watched in stunned silence, feeling as though he were caught in the middle of a science fiction movie. Once the creature was secured, the officer finally turned to Joe. "We need to take this for further analysis. For now, we need you to come down to the station. There are questions that need answers." Joe's heart sank. "Am I in trouble? What did I do?" "You're not under arrest," the officer said, his tone firm but not unkind. "But we need to understand exactly how this ended up in your possession." Reluctantly, Joe agreed, following the officers in his car. The drive to the station was surreal. Joe felt as though he were in an alternate reality where fish-like blobs caused police investigations. At the station, Joe was led into an interrogation room where he was asked to recount his story again, this time in painstaking detail. Every word, every action, every thought was dissected. The officers were particularly interested in how the creature had come to be in Joe's bathroom. It must have come up through the plumbing, Joe insisted, though even as he said it, the explanation sounded absurd. I mean, where else could it have come from? The officers exchanged glances, their skepticism palpable. "We'll be conducting an inspection of your property," one of them said. "In the meantime, you're free to go." Joe nodded, numb with confusion. As he left the station, he noticed several unmarked vehicles heading in the direction of his neighborhood. Whatever was happening, it was far bigger than a strange fish. Later that evening, Joe's doorbell rang. He opened the door to find his friend Mark standing there, looking both sheepish and concerned. "Joe, man, I need to talk to you," Mark said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Joe, still reeling from the day's events, gestured for Mark to sit. "What's going on?" Mark hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "Okay, don't freak out, but this whole thing might have been our fault. It was supposed to be a prank." "A prank?" Joe stared at him, dumbfounded. "You're telling me that thing in my bathroom was part of a joke?" Mark nodded. "We found it in the river last week. It was so weird looking that we thought it'd be funny to, surprise you with it. We didn't think it'd cause all this." Joe's anger flared, but before he could respond, his phone buzzed. It was a call from the police. "Hello. Mr. Martin, this is Officer Carter. We've completed our preliminary investigation, and we need you to come back to the station. Bring anyone who might have more information about how you acquired the creature." Joe sighed and looked at Mark. "Guess you're coming with me." At the station, Joe and Mark explained the origins of the prank in painstaking detail. Mark described how he and a few friends had discovered the creature in a shallow part of the river, marveling at its strange appearance before deciding to use it for a harmless joke. The officer listened carefully, his expression growing more serious as the story unfolded. "You said you found this in the river? Where exactly?" Mark provided the location, and a team of officers was dispatched to investigate. Hours later, they returned with startling news. The area near the river concealed an illegal animal testing laboratory. The lab was a hidden operation, using the secluded riverbank to dispose of evidence. Inside, officers found numerous exotic and endangered animals, many of them in deplorable conditions. The strange creature Joe had discovered was identified as a blobfish, a species native to the deep waters near Australia. Its presence in a small American river was not only bizarre but illegal. The lab workers were arrested, and the facility was shut down. The blobfish, along with other rescued animals, was handed over to conservation experts. Joe, Mark, and their friends were cleared of any wrongdoing, though they received stern warnings about the unintended consequences of their prank. The story didn't end there. News of the discovery spread quickly, capturing the attention of local and national media. Joe found himself at the center of a whirlwind of interviews and articles. While he initially shied away from the spotlight, he soon realized he had an opportunity to raise awareness about wildlife trafficking and the importance of conservation. The blobfish, now affectionately nicknamed Blinky, became a symbol of the investigation. It was carefully transported back to its natural habitat in Australian waters, its release celebrated as a small but meaningful victory for wildlife preservation. For Joe, life eventually returned to normal, though the experience left a lasting impact. He and his friends often joked about the day a prank turned into a police investigation, but they never forgot the lessons they had learned. As for Joe, he was already planning his revenge, a prank that would top all pranks, one that would surprise his friends without involving any endangered species or police sirens.